So a while back I bought this handheld PS1 emulator so that I could revisit all my old favourite horror games for the PlayStation. That got me wondering which of these old games are still scary to play. If it can creep you out on this tiny little thing, then it's got to be doing something right. So I flicked off the light, plugged in the headphones and started up some OG Resident Evil. I wanted to answer one simple question: is this game still scary to play? I'm going to explore a whole range of different aspects of the original Resident Evil, from its music, graphical style and tone, and how it works to evoke fear in the player. This video is going to have a loose structure. This isn't a university thesis by any stretch of the imagination, so enjoy it for what it is. I think the best word to describe this game is creepy, and it helps to know how creepy differs from scary, even though those words are often used interchangeably. When something is scary, we're talking about the visual or auditory effect of something. For example, imagine a ghostly figure with sharp teeth, long talon-like fingers and glowing red eyes. It's a scary image to think about. It might make a scary sound, like a low sinister growl or something to that effect. This figure might look or sound scary, but it would be wrong to say that it feels scary, because scariness is not necessarily something you can feel. In that case, you're better off using the word creepy. Rather than the visual or auditory effect of something, creepiness is based on the way something makes us feel for reasons we can't necessarily put our finger on or explain easily. Have you ever seen a face or a picture or a painting that just made you feel uneasy and you weren't able to figure out why? Well, that's what creepiness essentially is. It's when something doesn't sit well with your subconscious for a reason that is not immediately obvious, so your brain produces an anxiety response. Most people look back on Resident Evil. It's easy to talk about the cheesy, outdated, or downright incompetent aspects of the game, but the game remains creepy to this day in spite of, or possibly because of, those things. So with this video I'm going to try and explain how Resident Evil delivers its unique brand of creepiness. Let's begin with the game box itself. It's the first impression a lot of us players had of this game back in the 90s, but also I believe it evokes a lot of the qualities and themes of the final game. We all know there's something weird going on with this box. Unlike later Resident Evils with much more obvious and uninspired covers, this version seems to have a lot going on. It's very visually arresting. It grabs your attention and makes you want to find out more. As a little boy in the video store, Resident Evil was always this mysterious, frightening, or possibly dangerous thing that was only available to adults or the much older kids if you were lucky. And this cover contributed a lot to that mystique. To me, the most unsettling thing about the cover was the face of the character. The facial muscles have been contorted in a very unnatural way, especially around the eyebrows. I don't think it's possible for anyone to pull off a face like that, unless you had very abnormal connections in the facial muscles. But the face was deliberately drawn this way to evoke the dual themes of the game. Cover the left-hand side and he looks terrified. Cover the right-hand side and he has a kind of a badass expression. This is your first hint at the game's mix of explosive B-movie elements and subtle understated horror. It's a dichotomy which is present throughout the entire game, if you look hard enough. The cover art also works well because of the perspective involved. You want to know who or what the character is looking at, why he looks so terrified. What could possibly be so frightening as to cause the character to look this deranged? In fact, he doesn't even look terrified, he looks mad. The fact that he looks so crazy gives you the impression that he's undergone some prolonged exposure to something terrible. The faded imprints of spiders and claws give the impression that they're memories that have been seared into his brain. So he's not just under physical threat, but he's under mental threat as well. But the physical threat is kind of unsettling because the character's appearance grinds against the behaviour of the heroic masculine archetype. It's common for horror movie covers and posters to have a terrified character staring at an unseen threat, but they're usually thin, vulnerable young women, the kind who survive to the end while all the other characters die. This guy, on the other hand, looks like a stock 1980s action hero. I mean, you'd expect him to be played by Jean-Claude Van Damme or Arnold Schwarzenegger or somebody like that. You expect him to be calm, collected, and in control. Although this cover is often compared to the soundtrack cover of The Evil Dead, I find it more reminiscent of the Aliens film poster. Even in that case, Ripley looks brave and ready to stand up to the threat, and her body language is much more confident anyway. The so-called hero on this cover looks like he's about ready to snap. All these factors give the cover a very schizophrenic feel that will be present throughout the entire game. Now, by schizophrenic, I'm not referring to the mental illness or making any comment about it. I mean the general definition, a mentality or approach characterized by inconsistent or contradictory elements. When you start to look at Resident Evil as a game of inconsistencies, this theme becomes apparent everywhere you look. And I think it explains the anxiety that this game is still able to instill in me even to this day. Even after Resident Evil 7 and the remakes of Part 2 and 3, it's always been the original Resident Evil that I go back to that still creeps me out in a way that those modern games can't really do. So on this video, I'm going to really try and drill deep into why I think that is, whether it's just nostalgia or me being desensitized to horror up to this point. I think the first thing that separates classic RE from those later games is the unique way in which Resident Evil depicts its zombies. The first zombie you see is one eating the corpse of Kenneth Sullivan. That iconic shot of the zombie turning his head might surprise some younger viewers because the zombie has fully healthy, normal-looking eyes with visible pupils and irises. Modern films, shows, and video games tend to feature zombies with cloudy or missing irises. I'm not sure why they all do this, but it's easy to forget that in the old days, zombies generally had their irises and pupils fully intact. And to me, it actually made them scarier because it made them look more human, so their non-human qualities became more apparent. The infamous turnaround zombie had been adapted on 4 different occasions. Have a look at the 4 and think about which one is the most scary looking. First is the original game cutscene, then the cover of the director's cut version, then the flashback prologue for Resident Evil 2, and then finally the remake. Of these, 2 feature the iris missing, and the other 2 have the iris intact. For me, the ones with the iris intact are actually creepier. The first one looks more disturbing, especially with its blank expression and dry rock-like skin. It's that look of total indifference on its face, as if eating a human was just no big deal at all, and being discovered is no shame to it. So it manages to seem more human, and somehow also less human at the same time. So it's a much more unsettling image than the version that we see on the cover of the director's cut, which in my opinion tries too hard to make the thing look terrifying. The flashback scene in Resident Evil 2 actually strikes a nice balance, taking the original image and removing parts of the lips and widening the eyes to make the whole thing look a lot more menacing. Like a lot of players, it actually gave me a massive jump scare when I saw it. The remake version is certainly creepy, especially with the twitchy movements, but I still think it would have been creepier had the iris remained intact. So just for fun, I edited the irises in, and this is the result. Personally, I find the version with the iris creepier. Maybe I'm just a weirdo. I probably am, considering the fact that I'm making such an in-depth analysis about this. But anyway, I find the zombie reveal in Resident Evil 2 Remake to be much less unsettling than any of them, because the designers have gone to far too much effort to make the thing look sinister. To me, it just comes off like the zombies in The Walking Dead, so it feels a bit unoriginal and uninspired. Yet despite being more in line with the traditional George Romero zombie depiction, the zombies of Resident Evil actually defy a lot of the zombie conventions that you see, even to this day. As a zombie slowly turns its head, it produces a bassy, guttural sound, almost more akin to a lion than the snarls of zombies, like that which you see in the Resident Evil 2 remake. To me, that comes across more like an attempt to give the player a fright, rather than invoking a genuine horrific atmosphere. In the original Resident Evil, these zombies don't pull threatening faces or snarl menacingly. Instead, their expression is blank, producing only long, slow moans and whimpers. Almost as if they are lamenting their own bodies succumbing to the horrifying T virus. They aren't trying to scare you, they're trying to survive. To make it even creepier, it's implied that these walking corpses are not actually dead. Rather, they're just living, breathing people who have undergone the devastating effects of an aggressive retrovirus. Also note that there's only one zombie here, operating alone, as are most zombies in the game. Zombies in fiction, at least up to this point, are typically presented in large numbers, cooperating in a large group, with their large numbers being a primary source of their fear factor. The mass of flailing arms evoke a inoculophobic or claustrophobic reaction in the viewer. Inoculophobia being the fear of large numbers of people, and claustrophobia being the fear of being trapped, the latter of which is missing from shows like The Walking Dead, in which the characters are usually moving around in broad daylight, with plenty of open space and means for protection. I never understood why shows like The Walking Dead depict zombies this way, because it removes the horror from the very horrifying concept of a walking corpse. But in Resident Evil, they don't overwhelm you with numbers and broad daylight, instead occasionally posing a threat and instilling a dreadful ambience with their guttural moaning and aimless movements, emerging from spooky corridors like ghostly apparitions. So the effect in Resident Evil is more akin to being trapped inside a madhouse. It's a claustrophobic, morbid sort of horror. If they get close enough to you, they'll lunge at you for a bite, or they'll make slow movements in your directions. But overall, they're not rushing to have you killed. They're almost like decorations, adding to the macabre atmosphere of the place. Zombie fiction usually deals with themes of comedy, ultra-violence, or the hardships of post-apocalyptic survival. Films like Dawn of the Dead or Return of the Living Dead present zombies in a comedic fashion, while The Walking Dead seems to invite a voyeuristic response by upping the ante every season with its gore. Almost like the series serves as an outlet for fantasies of some people to watch human-like figures being brutally killed and mutilated, without the guilt of regarding them as people. Personally, I've never had a desire to view that kind of stuff, and it doesn't really excite me to see a zombie getting its head blown off, nor do I have much of a desire to escape into a post-apocalyptic fantasy. So I've always found the depictions of zombies in Resident Evil to be much more appealing. These zombies don't adhere to those violent or comedic themes at all. They aren't played up for entertainment or for laughs. Yeah, the dialogue is intentionally hilarious, but the zombies themselves are in no way comedic. They're strictly played for adding to the unsettling atmosphere. They operate in the realm of straight horror, being presented more in line with classic movie monsters such as vampires, mummies, or Frankenstein's monster, rather than the culturally significant zombie motif. So although I don't like censorship, the deleted scene with Kenneth's decapitated head falling to the ground, as cool as that scene was, it actually works against the effectiveness of this shot. You're not supposed to know exactly what the zombie is doing to its prey, and you're not supposed to be entertained by the violence either. You're only supposed to stare at the horror of the thing. Imagination does a much better job at evoking horror than an explicit display of gore would ever do. As you go through the mansion, you'll learn to assess each zombie based on its threat level. You'll eliminate zombies in narrow, high-traffic hallways, but in certain circumstances you can avoid them for the entire game, such as on the second floor of the dining hall. You'll only need to eliminate one, as it will be easier to evade the other sole zombie around this giant oval barrier. Or if you look at the zombie in the costume room, this one poses barely any threat at all as it's crawling on all fours. Unless you're an idiot, you can easily avoid this thing. So it serves more the purpose of keeping you moving rather than anything else. What this means is that there'll always be a few docile, harmless zombies lurking around, serving no purpose except to add to the atmosphere with their squishy footsteps and tormented moaning. The game doesn't want these monsters to seem threatening, only just enough of a danger to keep you moving. There's a real sting of humiliation when these things do butt into you, due to how easily they generally are to avoid, if you know what you're doing. So you respect their power, but they are infrequent enough for you to let your guard down. Compare this to that garbage horror game Layers of Fear, which makes a piss-poor attempt at emulating horror by bombarding your senses with horrific imagery, without any real threat being posed to your character at all. Unlike Resident Evil, there's no respite, no downtime or quiet time for you to get comfortable. Resident Evil is a smarter game because its tonal shifts are frequent and complement the horror aesthetic. So let's look at the music and cinematics. At the main menu, you're greeted with this opening live-action FMV, which looks a bit silly at first, like a Saturday morning Goosebumps cartoon, until the blood comes splattering on the screen and we're left with the image of that dead eye, much like what we see on the original Japanese cover. Again, we're seeing the image of that terrified male action hero, just as we saw on the Western cover. The game is reinforcing the idea that even the beefed-up male cops are not safe in this world, and that you, the player, won't be safe for long. What's strange here is that the musical note that plays after the blood splatters doesn't sound the slightest bit appropriate. It doesn't sound ominous or horrifying. In fact, it sounds kind of soothing, almost in New Age, like it's almost as if the game is telling you, shh, it's okay, it's only a game. Had they added a low, ominous sound, like the bass notes of a piano, this main menu might have come off as excessive or just too frightening for some people. But by adding that synth note, the scariness is offset by a more relaxing tone, which adds to the game's strange relationship with death and horror, as if Chris Redfield has found peace in death. I'm not sure exactly, but these contrasting tones work very well in creating a horror atmosphere. It's a mistake in many horror games today that they try to make every aspect of the game, from the textures, lighting, ambience, and music, as fear-inducing as possible. It's okay to change tone if it's done thoughtfully. The Resident Evil 2 and 3 remakes do this incorrectly, in that their characters are far too laid back, cracking jokes and banter and low-key flirting with each other, which in an apocalyptic situation comes off to me as even less realistic than the infamous dialogue of OG Resident Evil.
Water like yourself, put out the flames.
Fuck you. Claire! It's so nice to see you.
How are you doing? That helicopter just came out of nowhere.
I'm in one piece.
I'm guessing you don't have a key in one of those fancy pockets?
Unfortunately, no. But how are you doing?
You know, just surviving.
Anyway, back to the music. The game is filled with strange uses of music that draw from a range of different styles. The first bit of music is an airy synth choir piece of kinds that plays after you return to the hall, only to find Wesker gone. However, once you begin freely exploring the first floor, you get this brooding classical orchestra piece. The second floor music almost follows the same pattern as the first floor, except the key is higher to coincide with you being higher in the building. There are some points when the music sounds like it's straight from a 1930s gothic horror film. But the best example of how the game uses contrasting effects with music would be the save room. You have this soothing new age piece that feels completely out of place with anything else in the game. But it really contributes to the feeling of relief when you enter that safe room for the first time. And it makes you feel more nervous about the inevitable moment when you have to leave and brave the horrors of the mansion again. Resident Evil understands that you can actually accentuate fear by flavouring it with elements that produce the opposite effect of fear. Relaxing music, warm colours and bright lights all encourage the player to let their mental guard down in preparation for whatever horror is waiting for them around the corner. So this mashup of synth and classical orchestra means you have musical styles that wouldn't be out of place in a sci-fi horror or in a black or white monster movie. Another important example being the exhibition room. In my video, Significance of the Dining Hall, I discuss the various ways that the game uses foreshadowing, Though there's a higher concentration of it in the dining hall, it's actually a foreshadowing of death and loss throughout the entire game, and one way it accomplishes this is through the use of puzzles. The first puzzle you're likely to encounter is in the exhibition room, which involves clicking buttons under the painting, in accordance with the chronological order of cradle to the grave, beginning with a newborn baby and leading up to an elderly man. So even in its puzzles, the game is making you think of death, without even a violent or horrific context behind it. Simply to think of death and the inevitability of it. These kinds of depressive themes lend themselves well to horror, but they are kind of underused because of the bleak nature of it, I guess. The 2018 horror film Hereditary is an excellent example of how grief, mourning and sadness actually complement horror. Barely 40 minutes into the film, you've already experienced the loss of two characters with two funerals. It's because the writer understood that true horror is not really self-contained. It's usually deeply tied with our own insecurities and fears of death, and those fears are usually not as gory and entertaining as what we might find in a horror film. Or as Stephen King put it, I believe horror stories exist because we sometimes need to create unreal monsters and bogies to stand in for all the things that we fear in real life. The parent who punches instead of kissing, the auto accident that takes a loved one, the cancer we one day discover living in our own bodies. So the exhibition room has the player literally clicking through the cycle of life, as if to remind them that one day they too will reach your grave, with the crows watching overhead, ready to dig into your corpse if you should fail your journey. Interestingly, in the remake, the hallway in which you complete the puzzle actually leads into a literal graveyard. Though since the puzzle in the remake doesn't explore that death theme, the message isn't quite there. But in the original, it probably surprised a lot of players that completing the puzzle triggers one of the creepiest music tracks in the entire game. You wouldn't expect a music track to play at all, or at least one that sounds maybe a bit triumphant. It seems like such a bizarre design choice, but it's to remind the player that there is no triumph at the end of this road, only death. It also reminds the player that the walking corpses throughout the mansion are actually just people succumbing to the effects of the virus as one would succumb to the effect of age. Perhaps the fact that the grave of the puzzle leads you to find the star crest is a hint that the star's members are all destined for the grave. Yeah, perhaps I'm reading too deeply into that. Still, the exhibition room is a very important puzzle for contributing to the player's unease and foreshadowing of death and deterioration. The cinematics as well take you through a range of different tones and styles before the game fully opens up to the player. The introductory live-action FMV is able to brood a creepy enough atmosphere until it breaks up with all the bad acting and dialogue. Then we're pumped up with this explosive cutscene, which feels more like a cheesy 80s action movie than anything else. And that's all before we enter the warm and mellow interior of the entrance hall. The visual style here is quite surprising. It looks very welcoming, clean, tidy and warmly lit. Without the context of this being a horror game, it just looks like a nice, beautiful, neoclassical palace. Many of the paintings also feature relaxing and soothing images, as if the game is once again telling you to calm down and relax. But the warm colour palette, the idyllic paintings and general well-kept state of the mansion is just totally at odds with the fact that it's crawling with living corpses, skinless dogs and death traps. Not to mention that this place is supposed to have been abandoned for about a month. It looks like it's been very well preserved considering that. It's almost as if it's awaiting their arrival. For a horror setting, this place looks just far too inviting. But that does make sense, both in terms of the plot twist and the general incongruent atmosphere of the game. The 2002 remake, despite being a far superior game overall, kind of misses out on the schizophrenic element by going for a more spooky depiction of the mansion, with lots of greys and brown earthy colours, cobwebs, candles, shadows, mould, rot, dust and dirt. Also, I find that the remake mansion looks a little bit too lived in. Every part of it is heavily furnished with obvious signs of previous occupants. Although this does add to the realism, the original mansion had the eerie effect of many rooms being strangely absent of furnishings and signs of life. This had nothing to do with the hardware limitations either. The pre-rendered backgrounds could have easily allowed for much more richly finished environments. I think the sparseness of the mansion was a deliberate attempt to give this mansion the impression that this isn't a true home, rather that it might be a front for something else. Now, I'm not knocking the remake here. Overall, the remake's a much better game, and I really appreciate the atmosphere of the remake. Neither versions are better than the other per se. I like both renditions, but they both have a different effect on the player. And I think the comparison between the remake mansion and the original mansion is a great example of how something can be scary versus something that can be creepy. Have a look at the original backdrops and then have a look at their 2002 counterparts and think about the different feelings and emotions that they evoke. Think about the kind of horror tropes and media they remind you of. Think about the camera perspectives and how they give a different sense of orientation within each room. Which image do you find creepy and which do you find scary and why? These environments are also effective, obviously because they've been pre-rendered. This improves the game's overall visual quality, and the artists are able to illuminate or shade certain parts in order to make the environment as evocative and atmospheric as possible. Painters and artists know how to emphasize certain aspects of an image over others, and how to do that in relation to the perspective. All of this is lost when you transfer over to a fully 3D free camera environment. You simply can't use the environment to tell a story as effectively when using 3D free cameras, because there's no context for what you're looking at. For example, let's go back to the dining hall and look at three different versions. The original 1996 pre-rendered backdrop, the 2002 remake backdrop, and a fully 3D rendering created by Miguel Rivera using the Unity engine. Look at how in the 1996 and 2002 versions, the pre-rendering is able to really capture and bring attention to certain aspects, such as the rays of moonlight, the dangling chandelier, or the general size of the table. Which is obviously important because when designing a horror game, you want to bring the player's attention to things which are thematically significant or have a foreshadowing effect, in this case the table. Now have a look at the Unity rendering. As much as I respect Miguel's work and dedication here, it just looks so much more bland and unarresting. When you build a 3D environment, you can't make the camera emphasize certain things, since the cameras are moving in accordance with the player's whim, and objects and furnishings can only obey the rules established by the game's engine and graphical effects. The table is still there, but there's nothing drawing me to it or making it stand out in any significant way. The result is it just looks like a functional rendering of a scene, lacking the storybook quality that you can only really achieve with a pre-rendered background drawn by an artist. The original 1996 backdrops added to the uneasiness for one reason which the remake didn't. The quality and detail was just so much more advanced than that of the actual characters and living creatures. While these characters have disproportionate bodies, silly action hero outfits, and cheesy dialogue, the environments in which you're walking through are played out very serious, straight and realistic. The emotional and mental detachment of these characters becomes a literal detachment as they don't even occupy the same environment within the game code. It's almost as if these characters are from an entirely different reality than that of the world they're in. I'm not saying this was intentional on part of the designers, but the effect is the same. Whether you're noticing it or not, the backdrops in this game just don't quite add up to everything else you've seen. The first time you see these characters, they aren't even polygons, they're real people being recorded in live action. And now they're polygons in a flat, fixed world. Of course, this live action shoot was really done just to show the PlayStation's unique ability to play FMVs. But intended or not, all these things add to the surreal, detached atmosphere that pervades nearly every aspect of this game. Even the costumes don't quite add up. Why would Wesker be wearing sunglasses outside at night? Why does Jill wear an outfit that makes her look more like a Girl Scout than a highly trained tactical law enforcement officer? Again, I don't necessarily believe this was done to add to the atmosphere, but it's the ultimate effect that it does have on many players. A similar thing could be said about the writing. During the opening in-game cutscene, we get the full blast of the game's infamously terrible dialogue. It's so stilted and incomplete, it's almost as if the characters have brain damage. I know it was a Japanese game with a rushed localization department, but this dialogue is in a league of its own. People often compare it to House of the Dead 2, but at least that dialogue was grammatically correct, it was only acted terribly. Resident Evil, on the other hand, is just unacceptable by any standards. A part of me that wants to believe this was somehow intentional, as the developers deliberately wanted to create a strange atmosphere. If you look at the original Japanese script of the hilarious Jill sandwich scene, the original translation was, "You were almost turned into a sandwich." It doesn't seem as silly, but it's still a weird thing for Barry to say. People tend to blame the bad dialogue on the game's localization, as if it all came down to the fact that Capcom didn't want to hire professional translators. But even in the original script, the dialogue still felt a bit off. So, the last thing I want to discuss is the gameplay. Now, if you play the sequels or the remake, then go back to the original, you might find one missing quality of life feature. The maps tell you which room you're in, but not where you are within that room. The result is the mansion becomes a lot more disorienting, because if you're trying to track your movements against the map, you have to examine the room, then compare it to the representation on the map, then figuring out which door on the map you came from. This has the effect of making the mansion feel more imposing and claustrophobic. I personally don't have claustrophobia, but Resident Evil comes pretty close to evoking that kind of reaction. The mansion just feels like hedge maze at times, especially with the leafy green walls and earthy brown floors adding to this effect. The map can actually make it more difficult to orientate yourself, so you're advised to depend on your visual memory to get your bearings within the place. The game's effect of disorienting the player isn't only accomplished by the map system, but by the fixed camera. I've heard plenty of criticisms about this system, usually by people who grew up after the age of these fixed camera games and so they struggle to get used to it. One argument I heard is that these fixed cameras create artificial fear by unfairly hiding enemies from the player. While it's true that the fixed cameras can lead you to walking into zombies that your character could have seen, the complaint doesn't entirely make sense to me. Couldn't all fear in movies or games be considered artificial fear? When a piece of music makes you jump or feel dread, is that not artificial fear being created out of nothing? Even the very idea of a zombie or mutant lizard monster or a giant spider is artificial fear, because it's an artificial thing that is designed to make you feel fear that you otherwise would not have. The argument really is that by obscuring enemies from the camera's point of view, the game is finding a cheap way to scare the player. While I understand this point, I don't think it's an issue entirely, because the important thing here is that the player must learn to be careful about their movements. The character moves fast but turns slow, and they cannot perform a 180 turn either. They can do this dramatic reverse walk, but ultimately the only movement your character can do quickly and effectively is a straight run. What this means is that you need to commit to your movements. If there's a door on the other side of the room and there's a couple of zombies separating you from that door, you need to line yourself up perfectly and move forward, perhaps veering slightly to the left or right in order to give you more space for a lunging attack. The reason they call this tank controls is because, much like a tank, you can't just quickly move back to where you came from. The Resident Evil 2 remake gives your character far too much mobility, and so they supplemented it by giving the zombies far too long a range of lunging, which made encounters with these guys often feel tedious and frustrating. In classic Resident Evil, it all came down to you, the player. Dodging a zombie was a fine art. It was about planning the perfect room traversal and executing it without a hitch. If you need examples of how important room traversal actually is, go look at knife runs on YouTube, proving just how much of the game really is about dodging and weaving. Another example of the importance of traversal is found in the East Wing corridor. When the window dog jumps at you, there's really no choice but to move forward, hoping that the door ahead is unlocked. Turning back around where you came from is going to be too much work, leaving you exposed for an attack. If you're like me and you never bother to waste ammo on killing the dogs, then you have to learn how to get good at running through this room as quickly and efficiently as possible. You know exactly when to start turning your character left and when to reorient yourself forward. It's actually a good training hall for improving your traversal skills. Likewise, the possibility of a zombie jumping out in the next frame encourages you to stop, listen, and perhaps having your gun at the ready to see if any zombies move towards you. If you wait 5 or 10 seconds and a zombie hasn't entered the frame, you can be sure you're not going to get jumped on. You get this cool dramatic moment in which your character has a gun at the ready as if aiming up their perfect shot. Unless you're familiar with the enemy placement in a room, you're not supposed to rush through it. You're supposed to take your time, slowly moving forward, listening for sounds of moans and footsteps, making extra sure that the coast is clear before proceeding. So the issue here is not really about realism, it's about the effect it has on the gameplay and player. A horror game monster is not about how scary or powerful it is, it's about how it forces you, the player, to react. That's why Resident Evil's later enemies evoke a very different reaction in the player. As you advance, you begin facing more advanced, powerful enemies, such as venomous spiders and the fast and aggressive hunters. Suddenly you're encountering an entirely new kind of fear, one that's faster, more visceral and evoking a nervous physical reaction, rather than an emotional or subconscious one. Spiders are frightening for instinctive reasons, since they possess so many qualities that are completely alien to us as humans, such as the way they molt their skin, spin webs, or inject poison. The hunters evoke a fight or flight response in the player. Many times in both the original game or the remake, I'll enter the room carrying a loaded shotgun, and when a hunter jumps on my face, I instantly flee even though I could have easily taken it on. Modern jump scares are so overly engineered to give players a fright that they often come across as condescending and lazy. Hunters give a more subtle yet effective jump scare because it doesn't feel like the hunter is trying to give you a fright, only that it's pouncing on you as a predatory animal. So while the serious, bleak depiction of zombies serve as a harrowing reminder of our own mortality, the giant lizards, insects and arachnids ignite an ancestral primeval fear in us. It's almost like the game developers understood that they wouldn't be able to maintain the same atmosphere over a 7-hour campaign, so they changed up the enemy style completely. While zombies evoke the style of classic eerie monster films, those layer monsters are something straight out of a B-movie, and they just feel completely out of place in a neoclassical mansion. But that's just another case of the game evoking different styles and tones in a way that I believe works a lot better than what many people give it credit for. They also feel more triumphant to defeat, giving you that feeling of mankind conquering nature. But if you lose, you're left with that dread of mankind succumbing to nature. Sci-fi horror films such as The Thing, Alien and Fly all tap into this same terrifying notion that human beings are not significant, that they're vulnerable to the at times aggressive forces of nature, and that the divinity that humans cling onto will not necessarily save them. I'm not saying that there is or is not a god. I'm personally on the fence about that topic and don't pay it a lot of thought. But I think a good sci-fi horror should instill those same horrific themes in both the most devout religious person or the most committed atheist alike. A religious person might play Resident Evil and ask themselves if they were in Jill or Chris's situation, would some divine force come to save them? There would be the creeping dread that, no, they would not be saved. Likewise, the atheist might have rejected the afterlife on an intellectual level, but still partially learns for it when they imagine the biological horrors that could turn them into the same whimpering zombies of that mansion. It's not the zombies they fear, it's what they represent for us, which goes back to why keeping the eyes and irises is important, because we could become that monster staring back at us without surprise, as if he knows us personally. This is why the cover features not zombies but tarantulas and the arachnophobic response so many of us have. Why the loading screen or the game boxes repeatedly tell us to face our fears, because Resident Evil is not a game about zombies or monsters, but about fear itself and having the courage to stand up to it. I think Resident Evil summarizes why horror is such an important genre. Horror is about life and what it means to be a human being. It can teach you a lot about yourself. And Resident Evil, with its mix of styles, tones, genres and themes, does a pretty good job at doing that. Alright, I think I'm going to leave it at that for now. The video hasn't had the best structure. I wanted to just be a grand sweeping summary of most of the core ideas behind the creepy factor of Resident Evil and why I think it's such an important video game. Feel free to discuss. Thanks for watching.